Hello and thanks for joining me. It's been quite a while since I've uploaded a video, and there are several reasons for that, but rather than spend our time today chatting about my troubles and woes throughout the month of April, I would much rather chat about Moby Dick as philosophy, Plato, Melville, and Nietzsche by Mark Anderson, which is a book that I recently finished. And yeah, for a chat about Moby Dick, and a more appropriate setting might be the seaside, but where I am instead is actually the Arkansas River Valley of western Arkansas. I'm visiting my sister, and it's such a gorgeous day out. I decided to come outside and see if I could find a place to film among the trees in their sort of wooded area that they live in, which is a far cry from sort of the expansive oceans of the setting of Moby Dick, but nevertheless still a gorgeous setting for our chat about Moby Dick as philosophy. So yeah, this book was originally published in 2015. It's a nonfiction work by Mark Anderson. He is a professor, I think, of philosophy and classics at, seems like it's Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States. And I wanted to read this book because I wanted to read a book this year about Moby Dick. So this book fell into my priority reading category theme of books about books, and I really wanted to get a book read about Moby Dick. And I've read Moby Dick, the novel, a couple of different times, and then in 2016 I read this book called All Things Shining, which was a book about finding meaning in the classics of literature of Western civilization, and Moby Dick was discussed at length in that book, and that book made me really think, I think I really need to read a book about Moby Dick, because I think I'm missing a lot of depth. There's more depth to Moby Dick maybe than I realized. So I had really hoped by reading this book that I would get more, get more an enriched sort of experience with Moby Dick, and I definitely have. So what it's about, it's the author basically goes chapter by chapter through Moby Dick, but it's through the lens of a philosopher. So it's not he doesn't discuss each chapter in detail like a literary discussion. It's really a philosophical discussion. I don't think I really realized how much Melville was influenced by philosophy and how much of a philosopher himself he was. And so the author really explores this idea. Our main character, our narrator, is Ishmael, and Ishmael starts out the novel in really a state of despair. The author discusses this theme of the accursed questions. And the accursed questions are these questions of life, the meaning of life, or what our place in life is. Who are we? Where are we going? What are we doing here? Where did we come from? These sort of existential questions, I think, of life is the way that I understood the accursed questions. Some people, philosophers, can tackle these questions. And by philosophers, I mean just individual people who are thinking people can come through this and become and achieve wisdom at the end of it all. And some people can be destroyed by it. So in this novel, we have Ishmael, who starts out, as a young man who is depressed and actually is considering suicide, but instead he ends up joining this whaling excursion. And through this process, he is our narrator. So he is writing from the novel. His story is being told from years into the future. So he's telling a story of his youth. And so the story that he's telling is sort of his story of becoming a sage, becoming wise. On the other hand, we have Captain Ahab in the novel, who also really, I think, according to the author, really sort of addresses the accursed questions, but doesn't achieve wisdom, and is ultimately, becomes really destroyed by them, obsessed by them, and destroyed by them. I was going to say, he calls Ishmael a philosopher artist, and then Captain Ahab as perpetual philosopher, because Ishmael is a philosopher who, through the course of his experience, then achieves wisdom, like I said. However, Captain Ahab never does that, so he's always stuck in this. He's lost in this labyrinth of the accursed questions, and ultimately is obsessed by them and driven, sort of, not really mad, but destroyed by them. Queequeg, I guess, the sort of the native person that that Ishmael meets right off the bat in the novel is sort of serves as this spirit guide. So he's neither he's really just a guide that Ishmael sort of follows in order to achieve this sort of enlightenment. So this particular book doesn't really address the story of Moby Dick in detail. So I think if I had not read Moby Dick previously, parts of it I might have been a bit lost in. It does explain the philosophy part very well, though. The Platonic philosophy, the philosophy of Melville himself, and then the philosophy of Nietzsche. And I hadn't realized this, but Melville and Nietzsche didn't know each other or didn't know each other's work, but they did. Melville's older, so I believe Moby Dick came out before Nietzsche's main work. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly. But anyway, but they had very similar philosophical views, according to the author. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that the author did a really good job of explaining this philosophy, the Plato's philosophy, and then Nietzsche's philosophy, and then Melville's own philosophy. That Melville was a self-taught person when it comes to philosophy. He read a lot of German philosophy and philosophy in general, and we know of some. A friend of mine actually remarked, well, how do we know this is really true if this is just the author putting his own idea on Moby Dick? And one of the ways I think that we know that what Melville was thinking as far as philosophy goes throughout Moby Dick is he corresponded with the American author Nathaniel Hawthorne very intimately, and so shares a lot of ideas with Nathaniel Hawthorne as he was writing Moby Dick. And some other kind of ideas that I had about it was, one thing I didn't realize was that Moby Dick had not been a success. Herman Melville had been had some success with writing some of his sea adventures, but Moby Dick was not a success, and really he didn't really have much literary success after that, and ultimately wound up needing to go to work at a customs house and wound up a very unhappy and bitter person in his older age due to his probably his lack of success. He didn't have that outlet of being able to write what he wanted to write because he had to devote his time to earning a living, and he commented on that somewhat. So and Nietzsche as well, the difference between Nietzsche's success or lack of it during his life and Melville's lack of success during his life is that Nietzsche had an independent income and so could continue to write and actually self-publish his work himself, but both of them sort of didn't wind up as happy people. But the author makes the point that Melville is really Ishmael in the novel. His idea is that Melville at this stage of his life when he's writing Moby Dick is this optimistic philosopher sage. It didn't maybe last throughout his life as other things happened to him, and he was crippled by the necessity of earning a living and lack of success, like I mentioned, or whatever the cause was. But nevertheless, this sort of exuberance of philosopher sage. Ishmael is a young, naive person, like I mentioned, who nevertheless, as he's writing the story of the novel, we don't know how far in the future it is, but he's telling this story of his younger life, as I mentioned earlier as well. But there's a joyousness to it. There's a serenity to it. Unlike the really troubled mind of Captain Ahab, Ishmael is serene. Has a certain serenity to him. So anyway, I had hoped to in the course of in the course of this book, I had really hoped to come away with a deeper understanding of Moby Dick, and I think I really did. I'm probably not doing a very good job of explaining it because there's a lot of philosophy, but it's really readable. It was really readable to me. I'm not sure that I could understand everything that was talked about. One was the eternal return, how that this is an idea of Nietzsche apparently, where our life repeats over and over. It's like that movie. what is it, Groundhog Day, where you wake up and repeat your same life over and over again. I don't know that I really grasped that. I need to do some more reading on that. Also, this author, Mark Anderson, has written some other books along these lines that I think would be really interesting. So I'm going to have to put him down as a author to read some more of in the future as well. What else? I had a quote here from the book that sort of explained the Captain Ahab, because the Captain Ahab character to me is often presented as the main character, but and the author here argues that it's Ishmael who's actually the main character. He's the narrator. But the quote from the book is, Ahab asks the right questions, but he has so thoroughly identified the whale, a physical object, with the answers that he has reduced philosophy to a corporeal pursuit. So I think what he's trying to say there is Captain Ahab, he's a philosopher as well. He's asking the accursed questions, but he thinks he found the answer. So since he dogmatically pursues what he thinks the answer is, then ultimately he doesn't find wisdom. Ishmael, on the other hand, realizes that truth is transitory like the ocean. It's forever changing. And so he doesn't ever settle on what the answer is. So he achieves wisdom through that process. So I think that's kind of what the story boils down to. So I'm really glad that I did get this read. I don't know if another reading of Moby Dick is in my immediate future. I will reread it at some point. I'm thinking about listening to Moby Dick actually next time. Maybe an audio version of it. Just now that I have this different perspective of philosophy on it. So that'll be coming up at some time in the future. I'm not sure when. Not anytime soon though. So what I'm reading now, let me touch on that really quickly. If I can get to the cover. I am currently reading The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. This is a hard-boiled detective fiction from the mid-20th century United States. Raymond Chandler, The Big Sleep is one of my favorite movies. This was adapted into a movie starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And so I wanted to read some hard-boiled detective fiction because I haven't read any. So I had that on my priority reading list for this year. So I'm getting to this. I will have a chat. I'm almost finished with this, actually, and I'm loving it. So I'm almost finished with it, so I'll have a chat on this coming up very soon. And then my next read is going to be, I think it's going to be The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. This was a priority read of mine. It was a history selection of mine. This is a 3-volume work of the history of Nazi Germany. This is the first volume, and I had vowed I would get the first volume read this year. So that, I think, is what I'm going to read next. And then I hope to get back into the swing of things with my priority reading list. I did fall behind. I was ahead on my reading list, so I had planned to do some interruption reads. I've decided to hold off on the interruption reads for right now and catch back up on my priority reading until I get in a good place with that again. Once I once I get finished with The Big Sleep, I'll start my drawings again, like I used to do, to choose my next work and let the randomness of the universe choose the remaining. I think I have 13 more works on my priority reading list, and then I'll get to some free reading. So until next time, take care. Bye.